All right.
Okay, first, my name is Buddy Lindsay, and I'm going to be conducting this interview for educational purposes. If you could say your full name and say that you consent to this interview for the educational purposes of University of New Mexico.
My name is Bobby Quesada, and I consent to this interview for the educational purposes of the University of New Mexico.
Okay, thank you. Well, my first question is if you could, what exactly is your job's complete title, the company you work for, and the position you're currently in?
I am a senior recruiter for Randstad SourceRight.
All right, and what exactly does a senior recruiter do for Rhinestad SourceLight?
A senior recruiter is assigned to a certain account. I am assigned to the Progressive Insurance account, and I serve as a liaison between Randstad, the recruiters, and the hiring managers for Progressive. I actively source, interview, and place candidates for any job opening that I'm assigned, and I serve as a point of contact for those candidates to guide them throughout the interview and hiring process.
So kind of a way for bigger companies to contract out the hiring process in order to find the best talent.
Well, not just bigger companies. It's becoming very common that companies of all sizes, from mom and pop shops to multinational corporations, are relying on third party recruiting and sourcing in order to find the best candidates for their roles. But yeah, that is pretty much what we do.
So could you talk to me a little bit about your education um, in school and how that prepared you for the job that you currently have?
Well, in school, I studied political science, and what really helped prepare me for this role in political science was communication and relationship management. A lot of this role is based on serving, as I mentioned before, as a point of contact for the candidates, not only in sourcing them, but in conducting them throughout the interview process. I serve as their point of contact if they have any questions, if whenever issues come up in terms of background checks or scheduling for interviews, either with myself or with the hiring manager. I often serve as a point of contact to resolve those issues. Um, Relationship management really was developed through the education, because that also goes on to serve as my other role in terms of the progressive recruiters and hiring managers rely on me to be the point of contact for those candidates. And at the same time, there's the third part, which is from Randstad SourceRight. There's limited interaction between Randstad and Progressive, except through us recruiters. Other than, I think, quarterly calls that they conduct with each other, we really serve as the point of contact to ensure that we're doing the best for our clients, in this case, Progressive, and fulfilling their needs. So you could say that the education prepared me to manage those relationships, to think critically. It really helps me in evaluating candidates when I read through their resumes and conduct the interviews. I have to look for certain key elements that'll make them a fit for the role, and that's something that education really prepares you for.
Yeah, definitely. And how would you say your interest in the field got started and how you ended up in the position that you're in?
So, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was doing a job search, and a friend of my then girlfriend and current wife actually suggested this. She was also working at Randstad SourceRight as a senior recruiter, and she's the one that first mentioned this position. So I tried it out, really thinking that it may be a short-term thing. As in I would be looking to get back into a different field. Previously, I worked in the nonprofit world, but once I started working in recruiting, I found that I really enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun to guide somebody through the interview process, and then when you get to that point where you're actually giving them a job offer, it is a lot of fun to hear that excitement in their voices. It's a big step for a lot of people to get a new job. So serving, first of all, that's just a lot of fun in order to do that part of the job. But in general, it's a high volume role. I'm always busy, and it keeps me engaged. There's a lot of different skills required to be successful in the role, not only in terms of communication skills or relationship management, but also organizational skills. Um, oh, and now I'm blanking. I kind of overextended myself there.
It's okay. Um, could you talk to me a little bit about the professional climate in your career?
Do you mean like within the company or throughout the industry?
As far you can start with the company, but going into a broader perspective, the industry as a whole.
Okay. To start with the company, it's Randstad's a company that's going through a lot of expansion. There's different division within Randstad. It's a multinational company actually based in Europe, and Randstad Sourceright is the division that does North American recruiting for third-party companies. So that's where my role comes in. It is expanding a lot. We have numerous huge contracts with a lot of different companies, such as Progressive, MetLife, Honeywell, IBM. Uh, the list goes on and on, and it also goes down to little shops. In almost every major city within America, there are Randstad offices, and they focus a lot more on individual businesses within those communities. But as a whole, I would say that recruiting and sourcing has, over the last about 10 or 15 years, has really become diversified in how it approaches the candidate process. Something that I've learned as I've been in this role is that there's actually multiple ways to interview candidates. Um, Based on what you're looking for. There's different methods that have really come into play, and that's really been touched upon how the online community has expanded. You know, Not only job sites such as Indeed or Beyond, but also communities like LinkedIn. That's actively made recruiting and sourcing not only easier, as it were, for recruiters, but also a more engaging process for the candidates themselves. Candidates can actively put up their resumes, their skill sets, what they're interested in, um, and that actually helps them connect with recruiters such as myself. So it really does sort of expand on the industry itself has really been expanding over the last 10 to 15 years, and in all honesty, I only see it growing from here.
And would you say that the a company that takes talent like yours, individual recruiters that are especially trained in recruiting, increase the quality of employees within companies overall? And that service? Would you recommend that service to anyone?
I would definitely recommend it to most companies because I think a good recruiter, what we do is the first step is you talk to the hiring manager. You get a sense of what they're looking for, not only in terms of qualifications. Anybody can write a job description and make a list of things that they're interested in. What we do is find good fits for those roles, not only in the sense of qualifications, but if you're working in a team, what kind of team is it? Is this a team that's very buddy buddy? People rely on each other, very friendly, and we're looking for somebody that's a good fit in terms of they have a good sense of humor, they're gregarious maybe, they can roll with the punches, that kind of thing. Or is it a kind of team where it's very serious, very focused on the work? There's not much room for messing around. And what the hiring manager is interested in is somebody that is going to be very serious and focused on their work. Then we look for those kind of candidates. And that's one of those things that really comes across in the interviews. You can tell when somebody is going to be a jovial person in the workplace. Somebody that's going to enjoy not only in terms of working, but enjoy being around other people and try to be a friend with everybody. Or are they somebody that's really focused on the work? So that's one of those things that it's hard to do if you don't have the experience. If you're only doing hiring positions, maybe once or twice a year, you don't get that sense of talking to a lot of different people and seeing how they actually fit within each individual component. So I would definitely recommend it, not just for the large companies, but for anybody, or any company that is interested in finding long-term employees. And then, of course, there's other times where it's just easier in the sense that maybe for a seasonal role or something like that, like when they do, not only seasonal roles in terms of retails and stuff, but there's positions or there's companies that have to do, like, say, open enrollment for insurance and things like that. They may hire massive numbers of people for a few months to take care of all that. So they're looking for a certain skill set, maybe call center people, uh, people that can type very quickly, that are very professional over the phone, and that's something that recruiters can really help you with. They can help get you through and find you large numbers of people very quickly, but that still fit the requirements you're looking for.
Definitely. So you know that this interview is for an interviewing class, and I know you mentioned earlier that there are different methods within interviewing that you use. Um, in the class, we learned a bunch of different techniques from a textbook, but obviously reality is a little bit different than in practice. So could you give me maybe an example of a couple of methods that you've used in the past?
The two primary methods that I've used are standard interviewing and behavioral interviewing. Standard interviewing is kind of very similar to what we're doing here. It is kind of like just having, basically going through question by question uh, for an interview process. You maybe go through the employment history of the candidates. It would include kind of the catch-all interview questions that everybody knows of, as in, where do you see yourself in 5 years? What is your biggest weakness? Those kinds of questions that are open-ended and kind of let the candidates talk about how they want. That's considered standard interviewing. Another interviewing technique that I use, actually probably the most, is behavioral interviewing. Behavioral interviewing is where you're asking questions of the candidates, seeking specific examples from their experience. The idea is that past behavior predicts future behavior. So what I'm looking for when I talk to candidates using behavioral interviewing techniques is I'll ask them a question, seeking a specific example from their work experience, preferably more recent. I really want something within the last 6 to 12 months. If it's a little bit longer, further back, that's fine, as long as it's a relevant and strong example. But what I'm interested in is hearing the situation, how they responded to that situation, and then what the results were in the end. As in the sense that how did their behavior, how did that situation affect their behavior, and how did the behavior guide it to their conclusion? Within behavioral interviewing, some of them can be very general questions. We're looking for happy responses, and sometimes I'll throw them curveballs. I'll ask them questions where I'm seeking an example where they messed up. I want to understand the mistakes they've made in the past. But in doing so, I'm interested in finding out how they responded to that. If somebody made a mistake and then just walked away and let somebody else clean it up, to me, that's not a good candidate. But if somebody made a mistake and then took the time to fix the situation and then learn from it, that's a strong candidate.
So would you say that the behavioral interviewing techniques that you employ really produce maybe produce a more viable candidate for the company overall better, or do you find that those behavioral questions are more difficult to answer from the candidates, especially over the phone?
I believe that it actually depends on the type of position you're hiring for. If it's a kind of position where such things as customer service are very important, I think behavioral techniques are a great way to do it. If the position that I'm hiring for involves a lot of customer interaction, and the potential is there that you're going to mess up, or the company is looking for somebody that is very professional in their in how they interact with the customers, then I think behavioral techniques can be very important. It tells us a lot about how people respond to customers. If the situation, if their workload is very high, if they're very busy, or if they're dealing with a particularly difficult customer, then a past experience that's kind of like that and how they respond can be very telling of how they would do so in the future. But in other roles, I actually think that it's not as relevant. For example, I've done a lot of hiring in the past for, say, project manager or IT roles. And depending on the needs of the position, it may be such that what we're looking for is technical expertise. You know, I'm interested in somebody that can code in certain languages, or that maybe has a specific project management skill set, such as Agile or Waterfall or whatever. Um, if if the hiring manager is interested in those specific qualities, then that's going to be foremost. And at that point, maybe it's not so important that they have those behavioral techniques. And it kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, in the sense that if you're looking for somebody that is a good fit for the team, you know, in terms of either they're very gregarious or outgoing or something like that, or they're very reserved, to the point, very business focused. Those are behavioral questions. That's a good example of a situation where behavioral questions are very relevant. But if the team, you know, if the hiring manager isn't so much worried about that fit, if they're much more worried about the specific skill set, can they code in a certain language or something like that, then I'm going to be more interested in standard interviewing techniques. You know, what is your experience using X and X programming language? How many years? Where did you go to school? You know, what certifications do you have to back that up? So yeah, it actually does vary from situation to situation.
Yeah, it definitely does vary, of course, and there's a lot of different positions out there that your company hires for. So again, being an interviewing class, we hear a lot of examples. Being a professional in the real world, doing it in real time, could you give me an example of a behavioral question that you asked that you received a surprising yet effective answer to?
Well, that's going back. Um, I've gotten some weird responses in the past. Hold on one second. Let me pull up my list. I have a list of questions that I ask. So, one question that I like to ask often, especially when I'm interviewing for customer service type roles, is it goes like this. Sometimes we have to make decisions very quickly. Tell me about a time where you made a decision too quickly and what happened. So that's one of those questions that really kind of throws candidates, as in we're kind of looking for a negative example, but what I'm most interested in is how you respond to that. So a lot of people kind of blow that question off. You know, either they'll immediately say, like, "Oh, I've never messed up before. You know, I've never made a mistake or that I made a decision too quickly." And to me, that's not a good sign. You know, if you're not somebody that's willing to admit that you've made mistakes in the past, I don't understand how you're going to be willing to address your mistakes in the future. But questions or answers that I've heard that have been really effective about this talks about how people have made mistakes either when dealing with customers or maybe in leading a team or something, and then what they did to fix it and how they improve from there. So one example I've had in the past, let me think real quick. I had a candidate that I was interviewing for a claims adjuster role, I think in Arizona, and she didn't have any insurance industry experience. You know, she came from a banking background. But she was talking, when I asked this question, she mentioned that in the banking world, she'd worked primarily in branches as a senior banker. You know,
Oh, okay.
that's the kind of person when you walk into a branch and you want to open a new account or take out a mortgage or an auto loan, something like that,
Gotcha.
she's the person you would talk to. So in she was actually processing a transaction one day for a customer that was $10,000. It was
Oh,
the
wow.
customer wanted a check cashed, and she told me that to her company that's normally a big red flag, as in when somebody wants that cash, you have to it's automatically placed on hold, and the company investigates it, and then responds to the customer within X amount of time, like say 3 days or a week or something. But the customer was very upset, like he needed the money right away. So she had the authority to override it, and thinking that the customer was telling a good story and that she could trust him, she went ahead and approved it. And then it turns out that the check he cashed, it came back a few days later as fraudulent. So she had put the company out a lot of money.
Oh,
Um, but at the same time, she also learned from that. So she actively was able to help the investigation team identify and find the person. Like they were actually able to figure out who had cashed that check. And I think that she even mentioned that the police had wound up arresting him or charging him with fraudulent activity, or whatever. But that's kind of one thing. What interested me the most about her answer is what she did from there. She implemented a guideline for her entire branch that wound up being picked up by her district manager, where anytime somebody wants to do like a large check cashing, not only does it have to be approved by one person, which she had that authority there, but they
Right.
need a secondary approval. And that can be from another senior banker, it could be from the branch manager or the district manager or whatever. And every identification along the way was cataloged within an Excel spreadsheet. So anytime anything like that came up, it was automatically cataloged, and then that would be sent to her district manager. And like I said, that the district manager loved that idea so much, and the way that she implemented it, he picked it up and sent it out to his entire district. So that's what interested me the most. It's she made a mistake, and it was pretty bad, but she responded in a very positive way. She found a way to resolve the situation. She actively helped her fraud team to track down that individual, and then she went the extra step herself of coming up with a way to get around that, not to get around that, but to prevent that in the future, and then shared that with her entire team. So that to me is a great answer.
Yeah, that's a bold move, claiming you ousted your company of 10 grand.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd have the confidence for that one in an interview. Just a couple more questions for you. The first question I'm going to ask is, how have you seen yourself evolve within your career since you started?
Since I started this role,
Yeah.
I think it's the way that I've evolved. Well, first of all, I have become much more organization savvy. I always knew how to use Excel. I always consider myself an organized person. But in this role, I started handling a lot more data than I had before. I'll review hundreds of resumes every week in order to contact the right candidates. And I have to do so, excuse me, I have to do so based on legal guidelines. There's actually federal laws that dictate how people or how you review resumes, in the sense that if you have a job opening that has a lot of resumes and you can't review them all, you have to pick the ones that you review fairly. You
Okay.
can't just kind of cherry pick, and say that I'm going to review everybody that has an A name or a B name, that kind of thing. Um, you have to either randomize them, which most candidate tracking systems do, or you have to review them all. So
Right.
there are certain guidelines. Oh, and the third way you can do it is you can review them in the order that they applied. Um, and in order to track all that, that's something that I've had to do a lot myself. So in terms of keeping that data secure and then keeping all that data organized, I've become much more proficient at various tracking methods, organization methods. And then the other thing is, I actually have learned a lot about interviewing for jobs. I always thought, in all honesty, before I started this, I always thought I was really good at interviewing for jobs. But after talking to dozens of people almost every week and interviewing a lot of different people, I've kind of learned a whole lot about what people are looking for in job interviews. Even in how I give answers, I've learned how to structure them differently. I want to explain the situation. It's kind of like behavioral interviewing. Even if it's no matter what kind of question they're asking, I want to make sure I'm clear and concise in my answer, but that it's also something that anybody can understand. I've interviewed people in various industries where they're throwing out jargon like everybody knows it, and they're throwing out
Right.
acronyms and whatnot. And I've interviewed a lot of people, but there's times where I'm like, I have no idea what this person is talking about, and they don't think about it. To them, they're used to talking in this language, and it's inconceivable that somebody else doesn't know how to do it. So I've learned a lot about that too, and how to make sure that no matter who I'm talking to, that they can understand exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's definitely something you have to learn in the professional world. It's something that maybe the classroom doesn't quite prepare you for in a lot of ways. But since a lot of my fellow students, myself included, are coming out of the educational field and into the professional world, what's something that you would tell young people looking not only just to get into your field, but into the professional world in general, since you have such a wide scope?
I think no matter what industry you're going for, no matter what you're going to do, you always have to interview. There's always going to be some point, a place where you have to interview. And I have interviewed a lot of people coming out of, straight out of education, or straight out of their bachelor's degree or whatever. So the number one thing I'd recommend is practice. You can find a ton of questions online, interview questions. Some of them are very standard or whatnot. And what I would recommend doing is practicing. It can be in front of a mirror. It can be, with a friend or whoever. But you got to get comfortable talking. And another thing that helps when you're practicing is making a list of examples that you can talk about. If I'm going to go into a job interview, before I ever step in or before I ever pick up that phone or whatever, I'm going to have a list of examples from my experience that I'm ready to talk about. And I want a wide array. I want examples that show my leadership. I want examples that show my problem-solving skills. I want examples that show my organizational skills. And I also want examples that show times I've messed up in the past, but then what did I do to fix it? In any interview, you can be throwing curveballs. So it's not a matter of having set standard responses so much as being comfortable in your responses. So just taking that time to practice beforehand can really help anybody before they get into an interview. You got to remember that everybody has to interview, and it's always going to make you nervous. It's always nerve-wracking, especially the first few times you interview. And it's almost certain that every single person at some point is going to hear no. That's something you have to prepare yourself for. But to do all of that, to get ready for all that, you just practice. I think that's the absolute best way to get ready for an interview, no matter what level of experience you're at.
Well, that's all the questions I have for today. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I can't think of anything. Well, other than that practice thing, I can't emphasize that enough. It's very easy to walk out at the end of the interview and blame somebody else. Maybe you feel that the questions didn't highlight your experience, or maybe you feel that the person you were talking to just wasn't as interested in you, or you felt like you never had a chance before you go in. It's easy to get that culture of victimhood when you walk out of a job interview and you don't get that job. But the two things I mentioned earlier. First of all, you're always, at some point, everybody hears the word no. Everybody does get turned down, and once you get over that initial disappointment, if you're able to learn from that, if you're able to take that experience to see, areas where you could have done better or whatnot, then I think that's how you can move forward from there. And don't be afraid, especially if the recruiter gives out their contact information, to reach out to them. And I would say, particularly if you get turned down, reach out to them and ask, what could I have done differently? What did I do? What were my good answers? And what were my bad answers? I'm not going to say that every recruiter will ever respond, because I've applied for positions in the past and then sought feedback and never heard back. But it always is a great idea to try. Because that's something I really like to do to candidates myself. I do like to give feedback, and it is so rare for people to get back to me. In fact, I'd say out of all the turn downs I do, I hear back from maybe 5% of candidates. And I would be willing to do so much more, in terms of just giving feedback.
Right.
What areas could I have done better at? What answers were my good ones or whatever. So that's it. I mean, be prepared to, first of all, practice. Be prepared to hear the word no, but at the same time, be prepared to learn from that.
Definitely, that's great advice. definitely something that they tell us over and over again is to get back with the person that interviewed you, even if you didn't get the job. So it's good to hear a
That is
professional in the
very
field.
rare. Yeah, it's so rare that actually happens.
Yeah, it's. I think there's a culture going on in developing where that's not taught as much. Fortunately, I have had the interviewing class that's not necessarily required. It's required among others to give me that specific skill set. Well, Bobby, I want to thank you again for allowing yourself to be interviewed. I'm going to do a write-up and submit it. And thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, buddy.